Welcome to week 7, and this week's topic is intervention selection. So far in the course, we have learned how important it is to understand the organization and the environment in which the organization exists, and how it relates to the performance issue. We also looked at determining both the desired and current performance. The difference between the desired and current performance is the performance gap. Then last week, we learned about the behavioral engineering model and how it can be a useful tool in determining the cause or causes of the performance gap. Now we know and understand the potential causes of the performance gap. We can concentrate on the process of how interventions or solutions are selected to either establish, improve, maintain, or extinguish the performance gap. So let's get started. Let's look at the 4 objectives for this lesson. First, we will define what interventions are. Then, we will take a closer look at the 4 performance states that can be influenced by the interventions we select. Third, we'll take a deep dive into the process of selecting the interventions that we feel will help the performance gap. And then finally, I will conduct an overview of the various intervention groups available to help influence the performance gap. After the spring break, we will spend the next 4 weeks learning about the multitude of interventions available that can be used to resolve the performance issues. Now, as we do each week, let us now look at the Human Performance Improvement Chart to see how this week's lesson fits in with the HPT methodology. As I stated in the opening slide, we first studied how critical organizational and environmental analysis was to methodology, and we learned all about that. Then the next vital step is determine the actual and desired performance, and then we can determine the performance gap. Then last week, we studied the behavior engineering model to determine if the factors that caused the performance gap were either environmental or individual or even a combination of both. So now we are venturing outside of the analysis phase of the methodology and digging into the various interventions available to us as performance improvement consultants. Now let's define what interventions are. And I have to admit that when I first heard of interventions in HPT methodology, I was a little bit skeptical. Now suppose you look up the word interventions or intervene in the dictionary. One of the definitions you will find is to come between disputing people or groups. Now, when I heard the intervention, my thoughts are like group interventions when someone has a drug issue or some other addiction. Well, that certainly is not what we are talking about in HPT. An intervention in the HPT methodology is simply a recommendation or a solution to design, develop, and implement to change the performance state. In HPT, there is a wide range of interventions or solutions to choose from, and I think you'll be surprised at how many you have at your disposal to select. Now let's look at the official definition of interventions as found in the book Performance Improvement Interventions. Interventions are planned measures designed and developed to alleviate or solve problems in the workplace, thus affecting job performance. Now, there are several essential words in the definition that we need to examine. The first is planned. Each intervention must be selected very carefully and planned to reach the desired outcomes. Now, the second phase that's important here is to alleviate or solve problems in the workplace. The whole goal of the HTP process is to solve performance problems. We will not be successful if we just stop at just understanding the causes of the performance gap. We must make intervention recommendations that will solve the performance issue. Now that we know and understand the definition of interventions, let's take a closer look at the purpose of interventions. Interventions cause change. Now let me repeat that because it's very crucial. Interventions cause change. Now that change can be large or small, but it needs to be proportional to the performance gap and the behavior that needs to change. Second, interventions can influence an individual or several individuals. However, they can also influence groups and even the larger organization. In my experience of conducting performance improvement studies, I've influenced one division within an organization, like the case study that we are using this semester, and in another, when I conducted a study on the report writing process, it affected the entire organization. Now, other things to consider with interventions is there is an infinite number and variations that we can select from. Now, that's because of the different organizational and environmental factors that change from organization to organization. Also, we have to consider the performance gap. What is determined as a performance gap in one situation or organization isn't necessarily going to be the same in the next organization or situation. Then we have to consider the current and desired performance. This will be a factor when determining what interventions to select. What may work for a certain desired performance in an organization may not work in another. And finally, as we all know, workers are unique. So again, what may work for one set of workers or employees may not work for the next. In my experience, performance improvement consultants that excel at determining the causes of the performance gap and selecting the right interventions are the ones who are the most successful in assisting organizations with their performance issues. Now, I alluded to the next topic in the opening slide, and that is the changes in performance state. When we determine the interventions to select, we have to consider what state of performance are we trying to change. There are 4 states of performance that we must consider, all based on the performance gap when selecting the interventions. Let's look at each one of them. On the left-hand side, you'll see where it says the performance state, and those are the 4 performance states that we're talking about. Let's look at the first one, establishing performance. In this case, the performance does not presently reside in the individual group or process and must be put in place. So, if they don't have the knowledge or the process in the group, then you're going to establish performance. Now let's look at improving. The individual already has the performance and exists within that individual or group, but it must be made better in quality, quantity, timeliness, or cost. Let's move on to maintaining. That's the third performance state. And performance exists in the group or the process must be kept at the current level as much as possible. So they already have at that level and are maintaining. We just want to maintain the current performance. And then extinguishing. The performance exists in the individual group and the process, and it must be stopped. Something is happening there that we have to stop that performance. So let's take a look at and testing your knowledge in these 4 different areas. We'll look at 4 different scenarios, and we're going to have you select what you think is the performance state that we're going for. First one, a group of employees are not meeting daily production goals. Is that establishing performance, improving performance, maintaining performance, or extinguishing performance? Well, in this case, it's improving performance because they already understand and have the performance. They're just not meeting the production goals. The next one, Dave is the only employee who does not know how to use Excel macros. Is this establishing, improving, maintaining, or extinguishing? In this case, it's establishing because he doesn't have the knowledge of how to use macros, so we have to establish the performance. The next one, a team is meeting 90% of its production goal. Again, is it establishing, improving, maintaining, or extinguishing? In this case, it's maintaining because the organization feels that 90% of the production goal is satisfactory. And the last one, employee has been counseled twice in a month for improper email responses to customers. Establishing, improving, maintaining, or extinguishing? Well, in this case, it's extinguishing because of the improper email responses to customers. You don't want this employee doing that again. All right, good job on that. Now, shown in the slide is a simple chart that matches some of the various interventions that can be used to influence the different changes in performance. For example, if you want to improve performance, then you may consider coaching or training. If you want to establish performance, then some good selections may be job aids or again training. Moving on to maintaining performance, an appropriate compensation system could be recommended that is performance-based or maybe bonuses for a certain level of performance. And finally, if there is a need to extinguish performance, withholding rewards or even quite possibly removing the individual is the right intervention. So you can see that some interventions may be useful in several performance state changes. So now, that you have a better understanding of the different performance states, I challenge you to start thinking about your project, the performance gap, the causes of the gap, and how you are trying to influence the performance. Are you trying to improve current performance to move closer to the desired performance? Do you need to establish performance that does not currently exist? Do you need to maintain the current level of performance as it's acceptable to the organization? Or do you want to extinguish performance that is not welcomed or causing the performance gap? So now to review, what we've learned so far is that we know that interventions are planned solutions to alleviate or solve workplace problems, thus affecting job performance. Then we looked at the purpose of interventions, which can be large or small changes and can vary based on many factors such as organizational or environmental factors, the performance gap, or even the worker themselves. Then in the last section, we covered the 4 changes in the performance state. Now let's take a look at the process of selecting interventions. You see on the slide, here is the process broken down into 3 different areas or 3 different phases: the preliminary phase, the survey phase, and the selection phase. So let's start with the preliminary phase in step 1, where the group determines or conforms the performance gap. That should already have been done prior to this point, and you all determine as a group that's what the performance gap is. Then in step number 2, the same group determines or confirms the causes. Remember, using the behavior engineering model, we can determine and confirm what the cause of the performance gap is. Now, if you have multiple gaps and causes, you're going to want to move on and rank and agree on the top priority gaps and causes. And remember last week I gave you a worksheet to be able to do that, where you're going to go ahead and list all of those causes and then put a prior to them, because you may not be able to work on all of them at the same time. But in either case, if it's just a single gap or cause or multiple ones, you're going to move on to the survey phase, which is the second phase of this. In step 3, you're going to select potential clusters of interventions. Okay? And in just a few minutes, I'm going to show you a list of all the interventions that you have at your disposal to help you jog your memory. And from that list on step 4, you're going to select maybe 10, maybe 15 potential interventions. And then in step 5, you're going to prioritize the top 5 to 6 interventions. Okay? Again, because you have so many interventions and you might have multiple gaps and causes, you may not be able to work on all at the same time. So you're going to prioritize those interventions. Then you're going to move on to the last phase, which is the selection phase. In step 6, the group is going to select the interventions to implement from that list of 5 or 6. Then step number 7, the group plans the next steps, and then you're going to work with your stakeholders to know exactly what those are. So this is the intervention selection process. You're going to start off in the primary phase, the survey phase, where you're going to determine the different types of interventions and select the numbers there. Then you're going to go ahead and select the final interventions and then move forward. So now let's look at an example of how the intervention selection process will work. Here we have a performance gap that although employees attended training, they are resisting new software, preferring the various legacy systems, the previous legacy systems. Now, it was determined that the causes were that there's a few software glitches and employees don't know how to overcome them. New software is taking much longer to use at first, and managers pushing for speed. And the third cause is determined in this performance gap issue is employees can't remember all of the steps, and using the documentation on their desk is awkward. Okay? So the group got together and they determined some potential interventions, and these are clustered in the 3 different cause areas. So under the first cause, where there's a few software glitches and they don't know how to overcome them, there's a couple suggestions for interventions. One, a suggestion system so employees can communicate those problems. And then there's continuous improvement so that they continue to look at the issues that they're having, and then we'll be able to remove those glitches. Under cause number 2, the new software takes longer at first to use. Okay? The interventions could be a feedback. The manager stresses the importance of using the new software, maybe some of the benefits of this new software, such as generating new reports, and it's going to save them time. So that they understand it's important to be able to use the new software versus the legacy system. Also, too, in this area, you might want to have some type of reward system where there's a token of appreciation for efforts to use the new software, anywhere from maybe monetary to maybe something as simple as just writing down a thank you note. In the third cause, where the employees can't always remember all the steps, maybe we'll be able to use a job aid, some small notebook or sheet of paper or papers that contains only the key steps to jog people's memories. Also, too, you might want to have a coach ready available, and that's a person who is a subject matter expert. They can either call or maybe have them visit their desks to help them with the initial usage. So you can see how we went through the intervention selection process, used those 3 different phases and steps, and came up with some viable interventions to resolve this performance gap. Now, you may be wondering how in the world you're going to remember all these different interventions that are available. Well, in your course materials in Blackboard under Week 7, you will find this 1-page intervention selection guide. Now, it's a little hard to see, but there are 7 categories of interventions to choose from: performance support systems, job analysis and work design, personal development, human resources development, organizational communication, organizational design and development, and financial systems. Now, as I stated earlier, after we return from spring break, we will spend the next 4 weeks covering all 7 of these categories in more depth. But today, I'll provide just an overview of each group. So let's get started with the first group. The first group is Performance Support Systems, or PSS for short. This group is broken down into 2 subgroups: Instructional Performance Support Systems and Non-Instructional Performance Support Systems, which we'll see on the next slide. So let's go over the first one. Instructional PSSs focus on learning strategies that help workers store information that they may have to access any time they need for a particular work function. An example would be an online help function. Now, you would recommend this intervention when there is a gap between the worker's current skills or knowledge and the job's specifications. So in the context of the 4 performance states, this intervention would be used to change and improve the worker's current level of performance. Now, if this seems a little confusing, we will cover this more in detail in Week 9, the first week back after the break. Now let's look at non-instructional performance support systems. In this PSS we just covered, in the PSS we just covered in the last slide, we said that it was a learning strategy. In this PSS, we are explicitly focused on the processes and procedures. This group of interventions is used when a worker does not, but needs to know the exact work process or procedure. The information would be provided just in time or at a time when they need to know it. When comparing this intervention to the 4 performance state, This would be used to establish performance. The next group of interventions is job analysis and job design. The intervention is recommended when a job or organizational efficiency is in question. For example, there are two employees in an office that both have similar jobs. One employee has so much work that they can't complete it in the normal 40-hour work week and have to take the work home. The other employee barely has enough work to do on a daily basis and spends only about 20 hours of their time doing organizational work. There is obviously an issue here that may be solved with a job analysis and possible work design. And on the chart that you see, which we're going to cover more in detail the next time, is a look at the differences between job analysis and work design. If you look at the output for each, they are different. But again, we will cover this in week 9 after the spring break. The next intervention group is personal development. As seen on the screen, personal development focuses on the employee, where the organization provides opportunities to improve professionally and personally. Some examples are mentoring and coaching, which are very valuable for employees to understand where they currently are professionally and where they need and want to go. One of my most rewarding roles while I was working was to be a mentor and coach to my employees and others. And to look at my current role as instructor for this course, I see myself as your coach. I want you to gain knowledge in the HPT methodology and also in the academic graduate level writing skills. So remember that when you receive your graded assignments. I really am on your team. The next group of interventions is human resources development. As you can see here, HRD has 3 groups. Human resources management, which is the typical functions that you relate to the HR department, staffing, recruiting, employee relations. Individual growth, and this is an area in which I worked for most of my career, and that is employee development. And finally, organizational growth. This area pertains to the organization investing in its employees. As employees grow and are more productive, the organization grows and prospers. There is no better investment than investing in our employees. The next group of interventions is organizational communication. This focuses on how employees in the organization communicate within the organization, with other organizations, and externally with other groups and organizations. In week 12, we will cover this group of interventions. The next group is organizational design and development, and it's another set of interventions whose purpose is to improve the employee's work environment, which in turn increases their contributions to the organization. These interventions will help with employee empowerment and also design and emphasize organizational values if they don't currently exist or need refreshed. These interventions will also be covered in week 12. The last group of interventions we will cover, which will be in week 11, are our financial systems. It's imperative that organizations have financial systems that track all the organization facets that pertain to goods and services, employee pay and benefits, and to generate profits for the company and shareholders. Financial systems affect the organizations as it will generate its business and performance needs, along with learning and work environment needs. Well, that's an overview of the intervention groups. As I stated, there are a long list of individual interventions under each group. In the Week 7 class materials on Blackboard, you will find another performance support tool that is a longer list of interventions than the one-pager that we saw previously. Now, this PST is very useful when sitting down and deciding with your team and stakeholders what interventions you feel would help with the performance issue. Over the next 4 classes, we will be going over the majority of these interventions that you see on the list. Now it's time to look at the case study. Now this is going to be a little bit harder since we aren't in class together. But what I wanted to do was explain how I use the intervention selection process to determine the group of recommended interventions for this performance issue. Now, we determined the causes of the performance issues were a lack of an easy-to-use and accessible data tracking system that tracked all the hiring actions from inception to onboarding. We also determined a lack of an established hiring procedure. Each staffing hiring specialist conducted the process in a slightly different way. We also determined a lack of process documentation and availability to the staff specialist. And the final cause were that hiring managers had a lack of understanding of the hiring process. So based on the causes of the performance gap and using the intervention selection process, along with consulting with the stakeholders, we recommended the following interventions. Develop an easy-to-use data collection and tracking system to track each step of the hiring process from start to finish. The second recommendation was to train all the HR staff and hiring managers on how to use this new system. And finally, written documents on the entire hiring process with job aids that the staff can use. Although I left the organization about 3 months after they were implemented, there was a marked improvement in the entire process and employee performance before I left. So that's it for this lesson. Let's look at the lesson takeaways. Interventions are planned measures designed and developed to alleviate or solve problems, and that's the real key here, solve problems in the workplace, thus affecting job performance. With interventions, you have 4 different performance states. You're going to either establish performance, improve it, maintain it, or extinguish it. Deciding on interventions really needs to be a group decision with your sponsors and others involved in the study, because there is really a plethora of interventions available, and I'm asking you to use the intervention selection job aid to help decide on the interventions your group should implement. So before we leave, I'm going to talk about some upcoming dates. Of course, next week is spring break, so there will be no class. On March 28th, Part B, the performance analysis, is due. That's at midnight on March 28th, so you have a little bit of time to work on that. And of course, this is the most lengthy part of the whole process, and it's going to be the hardest, so I would say you need to get an early jump on that. Please use the template that's provided in Blackboard and also the free version of Grammarly. I've seen a lot of issues I think that would be resolved if you would just take a few minutes to run it through Grammarly, and then your grammar and academic writing style will be much clearer. And looking way ahead, Part C of the 4 different parts for this project is due on April 25th at midnight. That is the suggested interventions, implementation, and evaluation. Again, use the template that you find in Blackboard and also the free version of Grammarly. That's it. Hope you have a great spring break, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks. Take care.